Julian thought Arthur was merely furniture that breathed, a shadow existing only to pour Scotch and iron newspapers. He never suspected that for 12 years, our butler had documented every illicit transfer and whispered affair, waiting for my nod to serve the coldest course imaginable. As my husband threw divorce papers at me to impress his mistress, he had no idea his own destruction was standing silently by the wine tower, ready to speak. My name is Victoria Vance, and standing amidst the manicured perfection of Oakwood Estate, I realized that the humid Greenwich air was not the only thing stifling the guests. It was the suffocating weight of 200 social masks, all worn by the financial and political elite of Connecticut. This was supposed to be the highlight of the summer charity season, a gala to benefit underprivileged youth. But my husband had turned it into his personal theater. The air smelled of expensive perfume and impending disaster. Julian Sterling stood center stage, the late afternoon sun glinting off his crystal champagne flute. In his other hand, he held a thick manila envelope that looked grotesquely out of place against his tailored Italian suit. He tapped the microphone, the feedback screeching just enough to silence the string quartet and the polite chatter of the lawn. He looked down at me from the raised platform, his eyes devoid of the affection they once held, replaced entirely by a manic form of arrogance intended to captivate every person on the lawn. With a theatrical flick of his wrist, Julian threw the envelope. It did not glide. It tumbled through the air, struck my shoulder, and landed on the grass at my feet. Divorce papers. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen right out of the garden. Julian announced into the microphone that I had exactly 24 hours to vacate his house. He emphasized the word his with a possessive sneer that echoed through the speakers. He declared that he was finally purging his life of dead weight to make room for the true love of his life, a woman named Brianna who was moving in immediately. A deathly silence descended upon the estate. I could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes boring into me. Some held pity, the kind you offer a wounded animal you have no intention of helping. Others held barely concealed amusement, the schadenfreude of watching a high society wife toppled from her pedestal. I stood motionless in my turquoise silk dress, a statue amidst the chaos. I did not tremble. I did not reach down to retrieve the papers that lay on the immaculate lawn like trash. I simply watched him. Julian was not finished. He needed to twist the knife to ensure the humiliation was absolute. He spoke into the microphone again, his voice booming with self-righteous indignation. He told everyone present that he was tired of dragging a leech up the mountain of his success. He claimed I had contributed absolutely nothing to his illustrious career at Sterling Capital, that I was a decorative burden who spent her days lounging while he built an empire. He painted a picture of a parasitic wife, bleeding him dry while offering nothing in return but cold indifference. Then, the final insult walked out from the French doors. Brianna emerged from the crowd, young and undeniably beautiful in a way that was curated for social media. She walked to Julian and took his arm, beaming at the crowd as if this were a coronation rather than a public execution of a marriage. But my eyes did not linger on her face. They locked onto her neck. Resting against her collarbone was a vintage diamond necklace, a cascade of white gold and brilliant cut stones. It was my grandmother's heirloom, a piece that had mysteriously vanished from my safe 3 months ago. Julian had claimed it must have been misplaced by the cleaning staff. I did not cry. The tears people expected never came. Instead, I slowly turned my head to the side, looking past the gawking crowd to the edge of the terrace. Arthur stood there by the wine tower, his posture rigid, his tuxedo immaculate. At 60 years old, he possessed a British dignity that made Julian look like a petulant child. Arthur was watching me, his face a mask of professional detachment to anyone else. But I saw it. He gave a singular, almost imperceptible bow of his head. It was not a bow of subservience. It was a confirmation of absolute loyalty and a silent acknowledgement that the protocol we had discussed was now active. Julian thought he had just ended me, but he had merely signed his own confession. It is fascinating to watch a man dismantle his own life with such confidence, especially when he believes he is holding the sledgehammer. Julian called me a leech, a drain on his resources, a woman who sat idly by while he conquered Wall Street. He had no idea that the woman standing before him was not merely a housewife, but a senior strategic crisis management consultant sought after by the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. When a tech giant faced a data breach or a pharmaceutical company needed to navigate a recall quietly, they did not call their lawyers first. They called me. I worked under my maiden name, keeping my professional identity hermetically sealed from Julian's prying eyes, mostly because I valued my privacy. But lately, because I knew this day would come. For 10 years, I played the role of the supportive wife. Our marriage had begun with genuine affection, a decade ago when we were both hungry and young. But as Julian climbed the corporate ladder, the air got thinner, and the oxygen to his brain seemed to be replaced by a toxic mixture of greed and narcissism. He started believing his own press releases. He looked at me and saw a relic of his past, someone to be discarded now that he had reached the summit. The irony of his eviction notice was rich. Julian strutted around Oakwood Estate as if he were the lord of the manor simply because he paid the monthly electricity bill and the landscaping fees. He had convinced himself that these token contributions equated to ownership. He was blissfully unaware that the deed to this estate had never carried his name. The mansion belonged entirely to the Vance Family Trust, an entity I controlled. Arthur was not an employee of the household budget Julian managed. Arthur was an employee of the trust. He reported directly to me, and his paycheck came from a diversified portfolio that made Julian's salary look like an allowance. Julian saw Arthur as an old man, good for stiff drinks and silence. In reality, Arthur was a former military intelligence officer who had served my family for 30 years. He was not just a servant. He was the man who taught me how to play chess and how to spot a liar from across the room. To Arthur, I was not just an employer. I was the daughter he never had. My mind flashed back to a rainy afternoon 6 months ago in the library. Arthur had placed a cup of Earl Grey on my desk, his expression grave. He told me then that Julian was crossing lines that could not be uncrossed. He asked me if he should initiate the Black Book Protocol. I remembered the weight of that decision. I had looked at the rain against the window, feeling the last remnants of my love for Julian evaporate, and I had given Arthur the authorization. Since that moment, Arthur had not just been cleaning the house, he had been building a case. The silence in the garden was still deafening. I slowly bent down, my movements deliberate and calm. I picked up the divorce papers from the grass. There was a smudge of dirt on the cover, which I brushed off with the back of my hand. I stood up straight, smoothing the silk of my dress, and looked directly at Julian. I did not look at his mistress or the stolen necklace. I focused entirely on him. I offered him a small, polite smile, the kind a predator gives before the kill. "Are you absolutely certain you want to do this publicly?" "Julian," I asked, my voice steady and clear, carrying over the hushed whispers of the crowd. I needed him to commit. I needed him to hammer the final nail into his own coffin before I handed him the hammer. Julian threw his head back and laughed, a sound that was meant to be charming but came out jagged and brittle. He shook his head, looking at the crowd as if inviting them to share in the absurdity of my defiance. He truly believed I was attempting to salvage some shred of dignity in the face of his grand dismissal. He turned his gaze toward the wine tower, snapping his fingers with a sharp, dismissive crack. "Arthur!" he barked, his voice regaining that command tone he used on junior analysts. "Be a good man and take Mrs. Sterling's bags to her car. She is leaving now." But Arthur did not move. He did not bow. He did not even blink. He stood there like a statue carved from granite, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on Julian with a cold, predatory intensity that I had seen him use only once before, on a trespasser back in '98. The air between them seemed to drop 10 degrees. Julian's smile faltered, just for a second, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. He took a half step back, unnerved by the sudden insubordination of a man he considered a fixture of the house. I decided it was time to start peeling back the layers of this rotting onion. I stepped closer to the platform, my heels clicking rhythmically on the stone terrace. "Let us talk about assets." "Julian," I said, my voice calm but carrying the weight of an interrogation. "Specifically, let us discuss the Porsche 911 GT3 you purchased last Tuesday. A lovely gift for Brianna, I am sure. But I am curious about the source of funds for a transaction of $220,000. Julian regained his composure quickly, smoothing his tie. He looked down at me with pitying condescension. "It is called a performance bonus. Victoria. Something you would know nothing about. It came from the Novatech merger. I architected that deal. I earned every cent of that commission." He puffed out his chest, radiating the arrogance of a man who believed his own myth. He was so proud of the Novatech deal, his magnum opus, the transaction that was supposed to cement his legacy on Wall Street. Before I could respond, Brianna stepped forward, her voice high and dripping with unearned entitlement. She tossed her hair over her shoulder, the stolen diamond necklace catching the light. "Oh, just stop it," she sneered. "You are embarrassing yourself. Just accept that you lost and leave. This house needs a mistress who actually appreciates Julian's success. You are just jealous because he finally found someone who matches his level." I did not look at her. My eyes remained locked on Julian. I raised my right hand and gave a subtle nod to Arthur. It was the signal. Arthur reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket and withdrew a sleek, black tablet. It was the master control for the estate's audiovisual system, which had been set up to project a heartwarming video about the charity's work with orphans. Arthur tapped the screen once. Behind Julian, the massive 200-inch projection screen that had been displaying the charity logo flickered. The polite applause loop cut out abruptly. The screen went black for a heartbeat, and then blazed to life with a stark, high-contrast interface. It was not a video of smiling children. In bold, red letters against a black background, the header read, "Personal Profile Julian Sterling, Spending Log and Underground Transactions." A murmur rippled through the crowd, growing rapidly into a roar of confused whispers. Julian spun around, his eyes widening as he saw his name plastered across the display in a font usually reserved for criminal indictments. He turned back to Arthur, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. "What is this?" "Turn it off, Arthur. I order you to turn this damn thing off immediately." Julian lunged toward the control booth, but the system was hardwired into the tablet in Arthur's hand. The projection did not waver. Arthur tapped the screen again, locking the interface with an administrator override that no one else possessed. The screen remained fixed, a glowing billboard of Julian's impending doom, while the man who thought he owned the world stood helpless against the technology controlled by the man he thought was a servant. Arthur took a single, deliberate step forward, closing the distance to the stand where Julian had been pontificating just moments before. He adjusted the microphone stand with a gloved hand, his movements precise and unhurried. His voice, usually reserved for the quiet announcement of dinner or the arrival of guests, boomed across the garden with a rich, baritone authority that commanded instant silence. "Mr. Julian," he began, his tone devoid of mockery yet devastating in its politeness, "regarding the request for financial transparency you just mentioned, I would like to take the liberty of presenting the actual expenditure report for the household and your personal accounts." The massive screen behind him shifted instantly. The black background remained, but now a crisp, high-definition spreadsheet appeared. It was not a boring financial document. It was a timeline of betrayal. The columns were large enough for the guests in the back row to read clearly. It listed a recurring charge, highlighted in neon yellow. Every single Tuesday for the past 2 years, there was a substantial invoice from the Pierre, a 5-star hotel in Manhattan. These charges aligned with surgical precision to the dates Julian had claimed he was staying late in the city for board meetings or emergency strategy sessions. The room numbers were listed. The room service orders were listed. Champagne and oysters, every Tuesday. While I sat at home believing he was working himself to exhaustion for our future, Arthur looked down at his tablet, scrolling slightly before reading aloud. His voice cut through the humid afternoon air like a scalpel. On April 12th, Mr. Julian requested 24 long-stemmed red roses to be delivered to an address in Soho, the residence of Ms. Brianna. The cost was $350. Arthur paused for a split second, looking up at Julian. The instruction given to the florist was to code this expense under the household account specifically for garden maintenance. The gasp from the crowd was audible, a physical wave of shock that rippled through the garden. The polite silence was shattered. The wives of Julian's business partners, women who tolerated affairs as a byproduct of wealth, looked at him with sudden, sharp contempt. Infidelity was one thing. It was a common sin in our circle. But being cheap enough to charge your mistress's flowers to your wife's gardening budget was a violation of class that was unforgivable. The whispers grew louder, turning into a buzz of judgment that surrounded Julian like a swarm of angry bees. Panic finally broke through Julian's arrogance. His face twisted into a mask of rage and desperation. He realized the narrative was slipping from his control, and he reacted with violence. He lunged toward Arthur, his hand outstretched to snatch the microphone, to smash the tablet, to stop the flow of truth. But he never reached the butler. 2 burly security guards, men who had been standing unobtrusively by the perimeter, stepped seamlessly into his path. Julian slammed into their chests. He looked up, furious, expecting them to back down. But these men were on my payroll, not his. They held him back with a firm, professional indifference that humiliated him more than a punch would have. I stepped up beside Arthur, taking the space Julian had tried to dominate. I looked at my husband, struggling in the grip of the security team. "You said I do not contribute anything." "Julian?" I asked, my voice amplified now, ringing clear and cold over the lawn. "You said I am a burden. Let us look at who has actually been paying for this regal lifestyle you enjoy so much." I nodded to Arthur. He swiped the tablet again. The screen changed to a series of bank statements, red lines dominating the display. It showed a catastrophic hemorrhage of funds. The audience leaned in, squinting to read the details. It was a forensic accounting of Julian's personal finances. The slide revealed that his high 6-figure salary from Sterling Capital had not been going into our savings, nor into investments for our future. It had been drained, completely and utterly, into offshore online gambling sites and a series of disastrous cryptocurrency speculations that had crashed 18 months ago. The crowd fell silent again, but this time it was the silence of shock. Julian was not just unfaithful, he was broke. Arthur spoke again, narrating the slide with the dispassionate tone of a news anchor reporting a disaster. As the data shows, Mr. Sterling's liquidity dried up over a year ago. To maintain the facade of the successful businessman, to pay for the Porsche, the dinners, and the bespoke suits, he began transferring funds from 3 subsidiary accounts attached to the Vance Family Trust. He believed these accounts were dormant. He believed his wife did not monitor them. Arthur looked at Julian, his eyes hard. "I have tracked every single cent. Mr. Julian, you have been stealing from your wife to pay for the woman you are leaving her for." The graphic on the screen drew a red line from my trust fund directly to the dealership where the Porsche was bought, creating a visual link of theft that no lawyer could argue away. With the financial ruin of my husband established, the collective gaze of the party naturally drifted toward the reason for his bankruptcy. Arthur did not give the crowd a moment to recover. He swiped his finger across the tablet, and the red lines of the bank statements vanished, replaced by a folder icon that looked deceptively innocent. The file name, however, was anything but. It read Project Gold Digger, followed by the subheader target Julian Sterling. Brianna, who had been standing with her chin raised in defiance, suddenly went pale. Her complexion shifted from a confident glow to the color of ash. She realized, perhaps a second too late, that in our modern world, digital footprints are eternal. Arthur cleared his throat, a sound that signaled the beginning of the end for her social aspirations. He explained to the audience that Ms. Brianna had frequented Oakwood Estate often over the last few months while I was away on business. During those visits, she had connected her smartphone to the estate Wi-Fi network. Unfortunately for her, she had neglected to use a virtual private network, and our security system automatically logs all unencrypted traffic to protect the Vance Family Trust data. Arthur tapped the folder, and a series of screenshots filled the massive screen. These were not fabricated. They were high-resolution captures of her chat logs and emails. He selected one conversation thread dated 3 weeks ago and read it aloud. The message was from Brianna to a contact listed as Hot Todd. The text read, "The old man, Julian, is finally about to bite. I am going to get him to sign over the deed to the Greenwich house. Once we kick the wife out, I will make him sell it, and you and I are going to the Maldives for a year." Julian stood frozen. The blood had drained from his face, leaving him looking like a wax figure melting in the heat. He slowly turned his head toward Brianna. She was fumbling with her clutch, trying to hide her phone as if putting the device away would somehow erase the giant projection looming over her head. Her eyes darted around, looking for an escape route, but she was hemmed in by the judging eyes of the elite. Arthur was not done. He tapped a play button on the interface. The speakers, which had been perfectly calibrated for a string quartet, now blasted a grainy but audible recording. It was footage from the security camera in the west drawing room, taken one afternoon while Julian was supposedly at the office. Brianna's voice rang out, sharp and mocking. She was on the phone with another man. She laughed, a cruel, cackling sound, and said that Julian was exhausted after 5 minutes in the bedroom and that his conversation was as dry as the wine he pretended to understand. She called him a useful idiot who was desperate to feel young again. I stepped closer to Julian, watching the light die in his eyes. I did not shout. I did not need to. I spoke softly, but in the silence of the garden, everyone heard me. "Did you really think she loved you for your soul, Julian?" I asked, tilting my head. "She does not love you. She loves the wallet you have been stealing from me to fill, and now that she knows the wallet is empty, look at how she looks at you." Brianna finally snapped. She screamed that this was a setup, that her privacy had been violated, and that she would sue us for recording her private conversations. She stomped her foot, looking less like a mistress and more like a petulant teenager caught shoplifting. Arthur remained entirely unruffled. He adjusted his cuffs and addressed her directly. "I am afraid that is incorrect. Ms. Brianna, upon entering the gates of Oakwood Estate, every guest passes a clearly marked sign stating that for security purposes, all audio and digital activity on the premises is subject to monitoring. Furthermore, by logging into the guest network, you clicked agree on the terms of service, which explicitly grant the administrator myself the right to archive all data traffic. You really should read the fine print before you click accept." The revelation hit Julian with the force of a physical blow. His knees actually buckled, and he stumbled, catching himself on the edge of the stage. The man who had thrown divorce papers at me 10 minutes ago was gone. In his place was a broken, bankrupt fool who had just realized he had destroyed his life for a woman who found him repulsive. But as he gasped for air, he had no idea that the social humiliation was merely the appetizer. The legal nightmare Arthur had prepared was the main course, and we had not even served the subpoena yet. If the previous revelations were a tragedy of manners, what Arthur displayed next was a felony indictment. The atmosphere in the garden shifted instantly from the titillation of a scandal to the cold, hard gravity of federal law. Arthur swiped across the tablet with the precision of a surgeon, bringing up a new file labeled the Novatech file. He looked out at the audience, his expression grave. and announced that we were now moving beyond the realm of marital indiscretion and into the territory of white-collar crime. This was the moment Julian's arrogance finally shattered completely. The Novatech deal, the merger he had bragged about for months, the reason he claimed he was working late nights, was not a triumph of business acumen. It was a laundering operation, Arthur explained, his voice steady and amplified, that Julian had been using the tax-exempt status of the Vance family charity, the very organization everyone was here to support, to wash illicit funds for his silent partners in the technology sector. Julian had been sloppy, blinded by his belief that he was untouchable within the walls of his own home. He assumed that what happened in his study stayed in his study. He was wrong. Arthur had been shadowing him like a ghost. Every document Julian had crumpled up and thrown into the wastebasket had been smoothed out, scanned, and cataloged by Arthur before the garbage truck ever arrived. Every file Julian thought he had permanently deleted from his laptop had been mirrored and recovered from the main household server, which Arthur maintained. From the center of the shocked crowd, a man pushed his way forward. It was Mr. Harrison, the chairman of the bank where Julian was employed. His face was a mask of fury, turning a deep, alarming shade of red as he stared up at the 200-inch screen. He saw the logo of his own bank stamped on documents that he had never authorized. He looked at Julian with a mixture of disbelief and rage. I stepped down from the terrace to meet Mr. Harrison's gaze. I pointed to the screen, where a loan application for $5 million was displayed. "Mr. Harrison," I said calmly, "I believe you will recognize the signature at the bottom of this document authorizing a loan against the equity of Oakwood Estate. However, I also believe you will recall that you were in London on the date this was signed. Julian forged your signature to bypass the credit committee. He used my home, a home he does not own, as collateral for a fraudulent loan." Julian began to stammer, sweat pouring down his forehead. He looked at Harrison, then at me, his hands shaking. "I did it for us. Victoria," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "I was building a future. I needed the capital to secure our position. It was an investment. I was going to pay it back before anyone noticed. It was for the family." His words rang hollow, dissolving into the air like smoke. The screen flickered again, cutting off his pathetic justification. Arthur highlighted a specific transaction dated 2 days after the fraudulent loan funds had hit Julian's account. It was a wire transfer. Arthur read the details aloud, ensuring every person in the garden heard the numbers. On the 14th of May, a transfer of $500,000 was executed from the loan proceeds. The destination was a numbered account in the Cayman Islands. The beneficial owner of that account is listed as Ms. Brianna. The crowd gasped again. The link was undeniable. Julian had not just stolen from the bank and committed forgery. He had done so to funnel $500,000 to his mistress. He had risked his career, his freedom, and my family's reputation to secure a retirement fund for a woman who had just been caught mocking him on tape. The connection between his adultery and his embezzlement was now welded together in high definition for all to see. There was no gray area left, only the stark, black and white reality of his crimes. The reaction from Mr. Harrison was immediate and lethal. He did not wait for a private moment or a boardroom meeting. He pulled his phone from his pocket right there on the manicured lawn, his fingers flying across the screen as he dialed the head of legal and the chief of security for the bank. His voice was not a whisper, it was a command intended to be heard. He ordered an immediate suspension of Julian Sterling's credentials, a total freeze on all associated accounts, and the commencement of a forensic audit. Julian watched in horror as his career, his status, and his identity were dismantled in a phone call that lasted less than 60 seconds. The social reaction was even more visceral than the professional one. The crowd, composed of people Julian had spent years courting and mimicking, reacted as if he were carrying a contagious and deadly virus. They physically recoiled. A widening circle of empty grass formed around him as his so-called friends took several steps back. desperate to dissociate themselves from the stench of fraud. Men who had played golf with him last weekend suddenly found the architecture of the roof very interesting. Women who had drank his champagne turned their backs, whispering frantically behind their hands. Julian was left standing alone on his island of shame, isolated by the very people he had tried to impress. Brianna was the first to realize that the ship was not just sinking, but that it was already at the bottom of the ocean. Her survival instincts kicked in with frantic energy. She reached behind her neck, her manicured fingers clawing at the clasp of the diamond necklace. She managed to undo the latch and tried to thrust the heavy jewelry toward Julian, as if shedding the evidence would absolve her of the crime. She turned on her heel, intending to sprint toward the driveway where her car was parked. But she did not get far. Arthur raised a single-gloved hand, and the security team at the main gate stepped into formation, blocking the exit with imposing silence. Arthur's voice cut through her panic like a knife through silk. "I apologize, Ms. Brianna, but I cannot allow you to leave just yet. The local police are currently 3 minutes away." "That necklace you are holding is listed as a primary piece of evidence in a grand larceny report filed 3 months ago. To leave with it now would be considered fleeing the scene of a crime and possession of stolen goods. I suggest you remain where you are, trapped and cornered." Julian spun around to face me. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a pathetic, trembling desperation. He reached out as if to grab my hands, but stopped when he saw the look in my eyes. "Victoria, my love, please," he stammered, sweat dripping down his nose. "This is all a terrible misunderstanding. None of this is what it looks like. Can we please just go inside? We can talk about this privately, just you and me. We can fix this." I let out a short, dry laugh that had no humor in it. Privately, I repeated the word, letting it hang in the air. "Julian, you just invited the entire town of Greenwich to watch you kick me out of my house. You set up a stage. You used a microphone. You wanted an audience to witness my humiliation. It would be terribly rude to deprive them of the finale now. Let them watch the play until the curtain falls." Arthur stepped forward and handed me a thick, heavy folder. It was old and slightly charred at one corner. Julian's eyes widened in recognition. He thought he had burned these documents in the library fireplace last winter. He had no idea Arthur had retrieved them from the embers before they were destroyed. I held the folder up for him to see. "These are the original transfer orders you drafted," I said. "They are dated for next week. You were planning to liquidate the remaining assets in my grandmother's trust and funnel the capital into offshore shell companies, leaving me with nothing but the debts you racked up." I took a step closer, invading his personal space, forcing him to look up at me. "But there is a variable you failed to calculate in your grand scheme. Last week, I sold my crisis management firm to a global conglomerate. It was a cash deal." I paused, letting the silence stretch until it was painful. "And yesterday morning, I used that capital to purchase your debt. All of it. I bought your distressed loans, your maxed-out credit lines, and your underwater mortgages from the secondary market." I smiled, a cold, sharp expression that mirrored the woman he had tried to destroy. "I am not just your wife anymore, Julian. I am your primary creditor, and I am officially calling in the loan." I slowly descended the 3 stone steps that separated the terrace from the garden, moving with the lightness of someone who had just set down a heavy burden after a decade of carrying it. I walked right up to Julian until I was close enough to smell the fear radiating off him, mixing with his expensive cologne. Standing there, stripped of his arrogance and his allies, he looked incredibly small. The Italian bespoke suit he wore, which had cost $5,000, suddenly looked like a costume he had rented and could no longer afford to return. He was a man drowning in a sea of debt, wearing clothes that technically belonged to me. I leaned in close, invading his personal space in a way I never had before. I lowered my voice to a whisper, a volume designed for only him and Brianna to hear. It was intimate, but it was the intimacy of a coroner examining a corpse. I have known about Brianna from the very first day. Julian, I whispered. Arthur has been tracking the two of you for 8 months. I saw the confusion cloud his eyes. He could not understand why I would wait, why I would let him parade her around if I knew. I answered his unspoken question before he could ask it. I let you continue because I needed you to commit the ultimate error. I needed you to feel safe enough to touch the trust and arrogant enough to humiliate me publicly. Adultery would have gotten me a divorce. Embezzlement gets me everything. The realization hit him like a physical blow. I watched the gears turn in his mind as he replayed the last year of our marriage. He finally understood that my silence was not submission. My patience was not weakness. It was the stillness of a hunter waiting for the prey to walk directly into the trap. He had thought he was the master of the house, playing games with a naive wife, while all along he was merely a rat navigating a maze I had constructed for him. Arthur stepped forward then, breaking the moment. In his hand, he carried a suitcase. It was not one of the Louis Vuitton leather bags we used for our travels to the French Riviera. It was a battered, gray polyester suitcase with a broken zipper tab and a stain on the side. It was the exact suitcase Julian had brought with him when he moved into Oakwood Estate 10 years ago. It looked pathetic against the backdrop of the manicured lawn and the grand estate. "Mr. Julian," Arthur said, his voice smooth and dripping with a terrifying politeness. He emphasized the title Mr. with a subtle inflection that stripped it of all respect, reducing Julian to a naughty schoolboy. "I have taken the liberty of packing your personal belongings. The bag contains only the items you legally possessed prior to your marriage to Miss Victoria." Arthur set the bag down at Julian's feet with a thud. It looked light, disturbingly so. Julian stared at it, horrified. He knew exactly what was in there. There were no designer watches, no silk ties, no cashmere sweaters. Those had all been purchased with funds from the joint accounts or the stolen money, and they had been seized as assets to repay the debt. Inside that sad little bag were a few pairs of worn-out jeans, some t-shirts that had seen better days, and a cheap digital watch he used to wear when he was just an ambitious junior analyst. 10 years of climbing the social ladder had been erased in 10 seconds. He was back to zero. Brianna looked down at the suitcase and then up at Julian. The look on her face was not one of love or shared tragedy. It was pure, unadulterated disgust. The illusion of the wealthy financier had vanished, leaving behind a middle-aged man with nothing to his name but a bag of old clothes. "You are nothing but a destitute fraud," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. She looked at him as if he were something she had stepped in. Before Julian could respond to her betrayal, the police officers stepped forward. They did not just reach for him, they reached for her as well. An officer grasped Brianna's arm, reciting her rights. She screamed that she was innocent, that she was a victim, but the officer informed her that accepting funds from a fraudulent loan made her an accomplice to wire fraud and money laundering. As they dragged her away, she continued to scream curses at Julian, calling him a broke loser who had ruined her life, her voice fading as she was shoved into the back of a squad car. Julian stood alone with his battered suitcase, watching the only two things he cared about, his money and his mistress, disappear into the void. The distant wail of sirens grew rapidly louder until the sound tore through the heavy, humid air of the garden, shattering whatever remained of the polite party atmosphere. 3 police cruisers turned into the driveway, their tires crunching loudly against the pristine gravel that Julian had paid to have raked just this morning. The flashing blue and red lights reflected off the crystal glasses and the terrified faces of the guests, turning the charity gala into a crime scene. Chief Miller stepped out of the lead vehicle. He was a man I had known since I was a child, a fixture in Greenwich who had attended my father's funeral. He adjusted his belt and walked past the frozen guests. He stopped briefly in front of Arthur, offering a nod of genuine respect. "Good evening." "Arthur," he said. Before his expression hardened, he turned his attention to the man standing by the suitcase. Julian barely had time to process what was happening before he was spun around and pressed against the hood of the patrol car. The metallic click of handcuffs engaging was the loudest sound in the world. Chief Miller's voice was loud and devoid of sympathy as he listed the charges: financial fraud, forgery of banking documents, embezzlement of a charitable trust. Julian began to thrash, panic taking over his entire body. He craned his neck to look at me, his eyes wide and wet with tears. "Victoria, please," he screamed, his voice cracking. "Tell them this is a mistake. I am your husband. Do not let them take me. You can stop this." "Victoria." I stood on the terrace, my arms crossed over my chest, watching the scene unfold with a calmness that surprised even me. I searched inside myself for a pang of guilt, a flicker of sadness for the man I had once loved, but I found nothing. There was only a profound sense of relief. The cancer that had been eating away at my life for the past few years was finally being surgically removed. I did not say a word. I simply watched as the officer guided his head down and shoved him into the back seat of the cruiser, sealing him inside the cage he deserved. As the police cars began to turn around, Mr. Harrison approached me. The bank chairman looked aged by 10 years in the last 10 minutes. He wiped sweat from his brow with a silk handkerchief. "Mrs. Sterling, or rather, Ms. Vance," he corrected himself quickly. "I cannot express how deeply sorry I am. The bank's oversight committee will launch a full internal investigation immediately. We failed to catch the forgery, and that is on us. You have my word that we will cooperate fully with your legal team to recover every cent he siphoned off." The guests began to scurry away toward the valet stand, eager to distance themselves from the scandal, but desperate to get to their phones to spread the news. I caught snippets of their whispered conversations as they passed. They were no longer laughing at the woman who was getting divorced. They were whispering about the return of the Queen of Oakwood. They spoke of Julian with disdain, calling him a fool for thinking he could outsmart the Vance family. By tomorrow morning, Julian would not just be a prisoner, he would be a pariah. His reputation on Wall Street was incinerated. No firm would ever touch him again. Arthur was already moving. He clapped his hands once, signaling the catering staff and the groundkeepers. With efficient, sharp gestures, he directed them to begin dismantling the party. He pointed specifically to the large banners Julian had hung up, which read, "A night of sterling success." "Take those down first," Arthur ordered. "Burn them." I turned to look at my butler, the man who had arguably just saved my life. The chaos was settling, leaving just the two of us standing amidst the ruins of the party. "Thank you, Arthur," I said, my voice soft but filled with gratitude. The performance today was absolutely flawless. Arthur straightened his tuxedo jacket. For the first time all day, a small, genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was not the smile of a servant, but of a guardian who had successfully protected his charge. It is merely the duty of a butler to take out the trash. Miss Victoria. Night descended over Greenwich, wrapping the estate in a blanket of darkness that felt surprisingly comforting. For the first time in years, the silence within the mansion did not feel oppressive or lonely. It felt safe. The last of the catering trucks had rumbled away an hour ago, taking with them the debris of Julian's disastrous party. Now, it was just Arthur and me, reclaiming the space that had been tainted by lies for far too long. I sat at the desk in the library, the only light coming from the green banker's lamp. In front of me lay the divorce papers my lawyer had couriered over immediately after the police left. These were not the hastily scribbled demands Julian had thrown at me. These were documents I had prepared 6 months ago with a team of sharks. They contained clauses that were absolute, granting me full custody of all remaining assets and intellectual property based on the irrefutable evidence of his adultery and criminal activity. I uncapped my fountain pen and signed my name with a flourish. The ink was black, permanent, and final. The silence was broken by the harsh ringing of the landline. It was a collect call from the county detention center. I accepted the charges and pressed the button for the speakerphone so Arthur, who was standing by the door, could hear. Julian's voice filled the room, but it was unrecognizable. The smooth, confident baritone was gone, replaced by the jagged, wet sounds of a man who had been crying for hours. "Why were you so cruel?" "Victoria," he sobbed. "You could have just kicked me out. You could have done this quietly. Why did you have to destroy me in front of everyone?" I leaned back in my chair, looking at the phone with the same detachment I would feel looking at a broken appliance. "You chose the stage." "Julian," I said, my voice ice cold. "You wanted an audience to witness my humiliation. You invited 200 people to watch you discard me." "I simply decided to change the script of your play." I did not wait for his response. I reached out and disconnected the call, then immediately dialed the sequence to permanently block the number. That click was the sound of 10 years of wasted youth and betrayal being cut loose. It was over. I stood up and walked out onto the stone balcony that overlooked the rear gardens. Below, the lawn was empty, the grass trampled where the police cars had been, but the air was fresh. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool night air. Behind me, I heard the familiar, soft tread of footsteps. Arthur appeared, carrying a silver tray with 2 crystal glasses and a dusty bottle of red wine. He poured the dark liquid with practiced elegance. It was a vintage 1982, a bottle my father had saved for a special occasion. I could think of no occasion more special than this. Arthur handed me a glass, and then, breaking a decade of protocol, he picked up the second one for himself. "To freedom. Miss Victoria," he said, raising his glass. I clinked my glass against his, the crystal singing a clear, pure note in the night air. To freedom, Arthur, and to loyalty. I drank the wine. It tasted of dark cherries, oak, and victory. As the warmth spread through my chest, I made my decision. I would not stay here in this mausoleum of bad memories. Tomorrow morning, I would list the estate for sale. I would take the proceeds, pack my bags, and take Arthur to Paris. We would start over in a city where the coffee was strong and where no one knew the name Julian Sterling. I stood at the railing, looking out at the horizon. I was no longer the discarded wife or the victim of a narcissist. I was Victoria Vance, a woman who had reclaimed control of her destiny through intelligence, patience, and the help of a silent butler who turned out to be the most dangerous weapon in my arsenal. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please comment down below where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel Lily Revenge Stories, like this video, and support us further by hitting the hype button so this story can reach even more people.